Yeah, hi, it's Kate Ellis calling. You happy to start the interview? When I first started speaking to women politicians, I just wasn't quite sure what I was going to hear.
The fact that he just told me to f*** off, I just thought, he now knows that it upsets me. He's really not going to stop now.
Every conversation just started to build this picture that there is something seriously wrong in Parliament House.
Essentially, we are receivers of male decisions.
Trying to make women appear as frivolous is a tactic.
This became the sport.
The nastiness reached such a peak level, such hideous abuse. Quota girls.
Keep the pressure on her. She's a woman. She'll crack.
I was too afraid.
Do I have this in me?
Why is she so upset about
She
this?
can't handle it.
She can't handle it.
After all, God, she's a woman.
I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition stood next to a sign that described me as a man's bitch.
This isn't about feeling sorry for women politicians. Every single woman in that parliament has been treated differently than their male colleagues because of their gender.
Oh, yes, meow when a woman does that. It's sort of schoolyard politics, mate.
Did you do it because she's a woman?
It is just this toxic culture and it can destroy lives.
Federal Parliament has been rocked by claims that a female staff member was raped by a colleague inside a minister's office.
What did you say to him?
I told him to stop.
Did he?
No.
It's been angering and triggering, remembering the palpable male power and privilege in that place.
There is a very strong sense of what is next.
And there needs to be some restoration. The public have seen some glimpses of it and they don't like it. I feel like if we drew the curtains back even further, I think the public would be horrified.
It's just time to take a different approach. It's really clear that sitting back and just staying silent isn't working for anyone.
I think Cody wants you to throw the ball against him.
It's really strange when you leave the parliament and re-enter normal life that you slowly start to realise how the rest of the world operates. I spent almost 15 years in the federal parliament. I was the Minister for Youth and Sport, Early Childhood Education, the Status of Women.
Perfect landing.
Perfect landing.
I left in 2019 so that I could spend more time with my young kids and family.
That's better.
That's better.
Now I have a bit more perspective on what is normal. And you can see that some of these things that I used to just accept were just part of the job are really not okay.
Oh, it's going to come down. Oh.
When Kate told me she was going to write the book, I thought it was a fantastic idea. Good work. There's a lot of discussion around these things that are really cloistered and never break out into the popular press. There's a lot of blokes in politics, and I say this less as Kate's husband and more as a journo who's met a lot of them over the last 30-odd years, who are socially problematic.
When writing this book, I wanted to speak to women from all parties, to hear about their experience, to tell their story. It not only became really apparent that every woman had a story to tell, but also that these were the kind of stories that we didn't want to share with each other. You don't want to have a focus on spreading amongst your colleagues, hey, do you know who thinks I'm a stupid bimbo? Do you know who thinks I've slept with half the parliament? Do you know who was spreading rumours that I was caught naked in the prayer room? Going back and seeing some of these things or things that were said about you or things that were done to you, I actually felt like it affected me much more now than it did at the time. I always had a pretty strong social conscience. Like I remember year 8 giving speeches to the class on apartheid and racism or cruelty to animals. I was always looking for an issue. I was pretty naughty. I wasn't a good teenager. I'm sure my mother will have things to say about that.
Kate was a bit of a rat bag, a bit of a daredevil. She had a couple of years that were very challenging for me and her father and her teachers. The turning point was when her father got sick, and she was in year 11, and 5 months later he died at home.
My dad was a working class man. He went from managing a bar on an army base to running a supermarket and managing a Foodland. When my father died of stomach cancer, it obviously had a really big impact on me. And probably the stage of my life that I was in when he died was at that kind of turning point. So in some ways, I probably grabbed hold of the things that I knew that my father was passionate about so that I could carry them on. And that includes Labor values, but it includes football too. I got involved in politics at uni, and then I went straight from uni to working or volunteering for federal and state Labor politicians. When I first started working in politics, most of the MPs were men, most of the senior staff were men, all of the factional power brokers were men. I remember being a young staff member and being hit on by MPs. That wasn't that uncommon, but I know of much worse stories. I saw a lot of things, but I also heard allegations of what I'd call serious sexual assault and misconduct from an elected Labor MP. We've seen a number of stories recently, but I suspect that there are hundreds and hundreds more from across the political spectrum. This is something that isn't new, that has existed for a long time, particularly for female staff. After working for a few years as a Labor staffer, it was suggested to me that I should consider running myself at the next election. I ran in the 2004 election, and honestly, I was surprised when I won, and I was delighted that I won.
Mrs Worth today called to congratulate her Labor opponent, 27-year-old Kate Ellis.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
But I know that from my very first day in Canberra, gender was an issue.
Do you regret posing by a swimming pool in a sort of reclining, static manner? Or?
I regret that we're still talking about me being next to a swimming pool, yes.
Kate and I, we were close colleagues, and I felt a little bit, I suppose, protective, like a big sister, knowing that she would encounter some of the dumb sexism that I encountered in those early days as well.
Do you worry that you might suffer from the Natasha complex, you know, the young, attractive, smart, savvy girl coming to Parliament and being depicted as just that?
Oh, look, I think it's very important for me, as well as every other member of Parliament, to get out there and focus on policy issues.
Thanks very much.
I watched her ascent and just realised how much still had to change.
I intend to represent all those within the seat of Adelaide, regardless of their age, their race, their gender or their wealth.
I knew that she'd come crashing into ridiculous and demeaning and indeed sexist stereotypes.
I'd only been an MP for a couple of weeks, and we were out for Wednesday night drinks, and this Liberal staffer came up to me and quite aggressively just said, "Kate, the only thing anyone wants to know about you is just how many blokes you effed in order to get into Parliament." Just the fact that he came up and said that to my face, and said that to my face when I was an elected MP and he was a staff member, he still, you know, had the confidence to do that. In 2007, Kevin Rudd called me and asked if I'd like to become the Minister for Sport in his government. And that was huge.
Oh, sorry.
I was 30 years old, and I know that that would have put a lot of noses out of joint. There are a lot of people that would have thought, who the hell is this girl? And so it's probably no surprise that there were people who wanted to undermine me probably right from that appointment.
That was a product of her being a young, very visibly young female minister at the time. But there was one rumour which was particularly shocking and hurtful for Kate.
I came out of a meeting and I saw the look on my Chief of Staff, Shannon's face, and I said to Shannon, what's going on?
The senior journalist in the Parliamentary Press Gallery was making inquiries as to a story about Kate and I being in a love triangle. And the story went that we were both having a relationship with this gentleman in our office, and that was causing not only division within the office, but apparently even for the government of the day.
It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. Once it's printed, there's no going back from that. And I instantly knew if that story ran, it would be career-ending for me, and I would be labelled as a slut, and I would be labelled as someone who isn't really up to the job at all.
It was a very stressful day. You know, my career was on the line that day, and Kate was very conscious of that.
And it kind of escalated to the point that then I was speaking with the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, who, you know, asked me what was the truth about it. When I told him there was zero truth about it, he said, the editor wants to speak to you directly to hear that the story isn't true. It's like ridiculous that I'm there as a federal minister, and I just remember being on the phone to this newspaper editor saying the words, I promise I've never even kissed him. Like, how ridiculous. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, he later came back to me and said, I think we can get the story killed if we give them another story to run in its place. A story ran in its place on the Sunday papers about how Malcolm Turnbull had once tried to join the Labor Party. I was so relieved, but it's awful because, you know, it's not something to celebrate that you stopped a completely false rumour that your colleagues had made up about you from being spread nationally in the biggest selling newspapers in the country. The level of knowledge about the way that my office worked, who was in my office, meant that that story could only ever have originated within my own party from my own colleagues. The only reason to make that up was to undermine me.
The relationship between journos and politicians is often, you know, quite sort of parasitic in a way, or circular. The press is often like the sort of clearinghouse for whatever's flying around, and the mechanism by which people's careers can be derailed or destroyed and your own career can get advanced or the interests of your party can be furthered is through the press. He was so good this morning on air. He's just really natural and funny.
Well, you know, he's my favourite. Dave is amazingly supportive and at times I'd say protective. Did you say that on air?
Yeah.
Right. I think sometimes it was probably hard for Dave to see some of the stuff that we deal with every day that a lot of people don't get a chance to see. I think it upset him.
We met when I was editing The Telegraph and she was a minister in the Rudd government. I'd interviewed Kate a couple of times and I just thought I'd have a bit of a lash and back myself, and I asked her out for a meal. And to my eternal surprise and relief, she said yes. And it all sort of took off in a major way from there.
I think that people on the outside look at Dave and I and they see an opinionated talkback radio host and even more opinionated Murdoch columnist versus a lefty do-gooder politician or former politician, and people scratch their heads a bit.
I've got his lunch stuff already, so that's one less thing we have to worry about.
Yeah.
People think that we're going to sit around at home at night talking about tax policy or the welfare state, when the reality is that we're more likely to be talking about who's getting the kids from childcare, what we're having for dinner, and whether we're going to the footy on the weekend or not. We don't really care that we don't agree on everything anyway. But I actually think the one thing that Kate and I really do agree on in a really full-on way is that women in this country are often treated really badly.
when I was doing interviews for the book. I wanted to see whether this was something that I had experienced in a way that other women hadn't, or whether this was something that was pretty common to all of us. I was really curious to talk to Pauline Hanson.
Hello, Senator, it's Kate Ellis here. How are you going?
Hi, Kate. G'day.
There was a front page newspaper story with a pornographic picture that the newspaper was alleging was taken of Pauline Hanson when she was much younger.
Of course, I denied it, and then they got in touch, and even my ex-husband came and said, that's not her. It just couldn't possibly have been me.
Everyone's debating whether that's Pauline Hanson. At one stage, she actually said, I can prove it's not me. I'll show you my belly button. How insane is this? Nicole Flint responded to a local newspaper columnist mentioning in great detail her outfits, her shoe choices, her coloured jackets by filming a video.
So, Mr. Gers, what I want to know is, what should a woman in politics wear? How about a garbage bag to match your rubbish views?
It's not just the media who focus on your appearance and how you look. It's also other politicians, and sometimes other politicians in your own party.
When I became aged care minister, one of the senior advisors in John Howard's office rang me with a specific request that I not dress like a corporate lawyer anymore.
I know that Julie Bishop was told, can you dress a bit more like an aged care minister? And she didn't really know what that meant, but apparently it meant less Armani, more cardigans.
And I laughed until I realised it was coming from the Prime Minister's office and they were serious.
Sarah Hanson-Young was criticised for showing cleavage. Amanda Rishworth has had all sorts of feedback on her curly hair and what people think about that.
It's the remarks about how you look, how you speak, how you present yourself. Well, what's happened to your hair? It looks like the rats have eaten it. And why have you got your hair like that? Because you look like an old school mum.
Do you think that the reason that women get jumped on?
Everybody has had a story. Julia Gillard, whether it's her nose, her ears, her ass, her outfits.
Whether you're fat, thin, tall, short, blonde, brunette, pretty, ugly, good jacket, bad jacket, you know, all of the stuff that happens to women all the time now.
When Julia Gillard was elected as Prime Minister, I really hoped that all of this would change, that it would be a new beginning. It amazed me how quickly having a female Prime Minister just changed people's belief about what was possible. Every school visit I went to, I'd often start by saying, who thinks that they could be Prime Minister one day? There would be all these girls sticking their hands in the air and they saw, I'm getting emotional now, they saw that it was possible. And, you know, it's amazing, you know, the old, you cannot be what you cannot see. It's real.
I thought it was magnificent. I was a member of the Liberal Party. I was elected in 1996 into the John Howard government. And how wonderful for Australia to have a woman Prime Minister.
Women around this country saying, I understand.
Unfortunately, pretty soon afterwards, all of this sexism that had been bubbling away in the background just seemed to explode to the surface.
How to get blood out of a stone? Ask Julia, nice one.
What I want her to do is get rid of those bloody jackets. You've got a big ass, Julia, just get on.
Liberal Senator Bill Heffernan said she was, in his words, deliberately barren.
Put her in the same chaff bag as Julia Gillard and throw them both out to sea.
There was so much in our public discourse about Julia Gillard which was sickening. I just got more and more upset because it dawned on me and hit me just how far the tentacles of this octopus had spread, how bad we had let it get.
And there's a guilt, you know, did we let her down? Did we not do enough to protect her?
I do think you need to spend part of your time and energy calling out the terrible, in Julia's case, pornographic misogyny that was aimed at her when she was Prime Minister.
You have to prove yourself. I felt like I had to prove myself so much, even just to be in that place. Even though I was elected like everybody else.
I guess the first thing is...
I saw Sarah Hanson-Young as this tough person who was outspoken and was up for a fight. I felt a real sense of guilt when I spoke to Sarah that I didn't know that it was happening despite me being just a few metres away in the other chamber.
If you are somebody who is confident enough to stand up for yourself, you still do become a bigger and bigger target for that type of treatment.
What had been happening not just for weeks but for months is every time she stood up in question time in the Parliament, she was just having these sexual rumours thrown at her.
And just the brazenness. It started as off-the-hand comments, things about my dress. I had an MP comment, he'd worked out it was my period this week. Names of men that rumoured that I'd slept with whispered to me as they walked past me in the chamber as we're sitting down to vote. All those things that are designed as mind warfare to f with your head so that you can't deliver. You know, there is an expectation that, especially as a woman, that if you show any element of vulnerability, then it just proves everyone's point.
And what I didn't realise was the impact that that was having on her. She stopped going to question time, stopped going or left early, you know, kind of sat there and tried not to be seen.
They have produced a detailed report.
I became really quite anxious of being in the chamber, nervous about who was going to say what. In 2018, we'd been debating a motion in relation to violence against women in the Senate chamber. And Mr Lionhelm, at the time, a senator, yelled across at me at the chamber, "Should stop shagging men, Sarah." I heard it as clear as a bell. I was quite shocked. I walked over to him and I said quietly, what did you just say to me? And he confirmed that he had said this. I told him he was a creep. And he told me to f*** off.
Senator O'Sullivan, Senator Anning, Senator Bernardi, Senator Lionhelm. You day after day come into this place and hurl insults across this chamber, play the gender card, and the moment anyone stands up to you, you have the most fragile glass jaws of all. You are cowards.
I decided I had to take him to court. And I won that case. The court found that Senator Lionhelm defamed me. I feel like I'm 100 times stronger than I ever was. You're not having to put all that armour on every day because it's now like, oh, I know what your game is. And I've told everybody else that's your game too.
Congratulations. Well done.
Thank you so
Fantastic.
much. Thank you.
What a champion you are.
In my last term of Parliament, Julia Banks was elected as a Liberal MP. She came in at a time when Malcolm Turnbull had spoken up in opposition to Tony Abbott only having one woman in his cabinet and spoke of wanting to promote more women.
I want to acknowledge our new members. Let me begin firstly with Julia Banks.
One of the triggers for me to enter was their calls for more women. So I thought, well, I'll join the Liberal Party. I've got a lot to give them in terms of my 25 years of experience in the legal and corporate sector. I was immediately struck by the fact that it reminded me of when I first entered the workforce back in the late 80s, in terms of its attitudes to women. One of the first events when I was the pre-selected candidate was being run by the branch official. He'd sent me the draft agenda and some other bloke was speaking. I said, I'm the pre-selected candidate of this electorate. Like, where's my gig? And he said, don't you worry about that, darling. We'll give you the raffle. And I thought he was joking, but he wasn't.
I think the thing that's interesting about Julia's experience is that she wasn't like me where she grew up in politics and she found it jarring to see the culture when it came to women.
You don't have to wait for the Christmas party or the sales conference for misconduct to happen. Once I was walking down the corridor and an MP, a Liberal MP, was walking in the opposite direction with a staff member. And then he introduced me to his staffer, and she was very young. She looked like she was in her 20s. He had his hand like that, and he was rubbing it up and down her back. And I just looked at her, and her look at me, her non-verbal cue to me was almost, don't say anything, please don't say anything. I know this isn't right, but please don't say anything. And the reality was there is no formal mechanism where I could say something and protect her. Casual sexism throughout our federal parliament is what I witnessed and observed and experienced myself for the term that I was there.
I think she's coming.
Hey.
Hello. Hey, Charlie Bear. How are you?
When Kate told me she was leaving federal parliament, I had very conflicted feelings.
How are you? Good. Hi, Charlie Bear. Little girl.
I'd watched her kind of smash through so many barriers as a young woman in that role.
Children don't stay babies forever. When Sam was born, he would travel with me to Canberra. When he got a bit older, I had to make a decision. And in the end, that decision was that I didn't want to be away from him for what would most likely be more days a year than I'd be with him.
I still can't believe you did it. You've resisted writing a book your whole career.
Yes, I know. Well, desperate
Too much
times.
to say.
Yes. So hopefully we'll start a bit of a debate.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was really terrified of writing a book that might discourage women from entering politics. That's not what I'm trying to do. I just want it to be better for them when they get there. It's a culture that needs to be examined and it needs to change.
Women are allowed to be cranky sometimes too, aren't we? Yeah. That's when we jump up and down and get things done. Change the system. Oh, yeah.
And I think it's time for a change!
Women at rallies right across this country right now will not be silenced.
This is a remarkable time. Women have had enough.
I feel like there's a reckoning going on. Younger and more vulnerable women who are not MPs are now speaking out. And that is huge. That shows that we are at a point of no return.
We are collectively a disappointment to the people in Australia, and that's appalling for the National Parliament.
How many more of these revolting, disgusting and upsetting stories can we have come out?
Well, there was another allegation of rape in an Australian Parliament aired yesterday.
But this is just out of control.
Senior government staff performing sex acts on the desk of a female MP.
As a Liberal woman, I am really disgusted.
I have had an absolute gutful.
Women are standing up saying we're not going to be silent anymore, we're going to call it out, and most importantly, we're going to demand change. And I want to be a part of that.